In the dead of night, three riders came. No lanterns, no mercy. A lone rancher stood on his porch, rifle steady, heart pounding like a war drum. Behind him, the girl he'd once pulled from chains now trembled in the shadows. The same girl those men came to drag back to hell. They thought she was theirs by law, by paper, by brute force. But under the cold desert stars, one gunshot would decide who she belonged to, or if she belonged to no one at all. The rancher spoke low, voice like gravel. "You best turn around, boys. This land's got no room for thieves." The tallest rider spat, eyes glinting. "She's ours by right. Stand down, or bleed." The wind held its breath. Then, a finger tightened on the trigger. Before Reese Hollow ever found Marin Blythe tied behind that saloon, her life was already a brutal ledger of debts, broken promises, and quiet betrayals that never made the gossip pages of Dustle. Long before that rope bit into her wrists, Marin was just a skinny barefoot girl running along the fence line of the Finch homestead. The smell of chickens, wood smoke, and stale whiskey was her entire world. Her mama had died when she was 8, a coughing fever that took her in the dead of winter. After that, it was just Marin, her brother Eli, and Grover Finch, the man who'd taken their mother's hand in marriage but never saw those children as more than burdens or bargaining chips. Eli was her shield. Older by 4 years, he'd pull her behind the barn when Grover's boots started stomping, take the belt to his own back just so she wouldn't have to. Folks in town used to shake their heads at Eli. "That boy's too soft for this country. He'll get himself killed standing up for a girl that ain't worth spit." That's what they said, like Marin was just a mouth to feed, not a life worth saving. But Eli never heard that talk. Or if he did, he didn't care. One night, Grover came home drunker than usual, pockets turned inside out from a poker table back behind the Dustle Saloon. He'd wagered the mule and lost. Then the chickens. Then the hunting rifle that Eli had fixed up for years with scraps and hope. And when there was nothing left to wager, there was Marin. Eli tried to stop him. He begged Grover not to sign that slip of paper that said Marin could be taken as payment for a debt Grover had no way to repay. Grover beat him for that. Beat him so long and so hard that when the dawn broke over the low hills, Eli was lying in the hayloft staring up at the dusty beams, breath rattling like wind through dead leaves. He fell asleep 2 days later and never woke up. No lawman knocked on their door. No preacher came to ask what happened. A girl's bruises weren't worth the trouble when every man in town knew a stepfather's authority was law enough. That's what strikes me every time I revisit this piece of Marin's story. How many real girls on the frontier lived and died this way? How many fathers and stepfathers wagered their own blood for a hand of cards or a bottle of rot-gut whiskey? Back then, if you were a woman, especially a young one without a name worth fighting for, you were little more than property. You didn't have a deed or a title. You didn't have someone willing to stand at your side, rifle ready, saying, "Not tonight, not ever again." That's why Marin's story feels like a whisper for all the girls who never got out. And then there's Reese Hollow. Folks called him Hollow for good reason. A big, quiet man with shoulders like a split fence post. A voice that rumbled low and steady, but rarely got raised. He'd come to that stretch of land years back with a young wife named Clara, all hopes pinned on the child they thought would make that homestead a family. But Clara died in childbirth. A baby boy born without breath and a mother buried under a tree behind the barn. Reese dug that grave himself, planted a ring of scrub pines around it to keep the winds from sweeping her away. And every spring, when the snowmelt turned the dirt soft and the first wildflowers clawed their way through the clay, he'd leave a handful of purple asters on Clara's marker. He never talked about her, never told the men at the feed store or the preacher in town how the silence clawed at him at night. He just carried it, the grief packed tight between his ribs like an old wound you stop picking at because you know it won't ever heal. How many men like Reese live this way, taught that real strength is silence, that you swallow your loss down so deep no one else has to see it, so no one calls you weak? But maybe real strength ain't about bearing the pain. Maybe it's what you do with it when you see someone who's been broken the same way. Maybe it's the simple act of offering a basin of water, a slice of bread, a roof with no lock on the door. Maybe strength is the quiet thing you offer someone else when they have nothing left. And that's why Marin Blythe's story, her scars, her brother's ghost, Reese's flowers on that grave, still matters. Because every chain that bound her was forged in silence, and every chain that fell was broken by small, stubborn kindness. The kind no law ever wrote, but that saves a soul just the same. So what did those early days on Reese Hollow's land really look like for Marin Blythe? Not some grand rescue, no blazing hero's entrance with a white horse and a shootout under the sunset. No, the truth of it was quieter, raw, awkward in its simplicity. 100 small moments strung together like beads, each one whispering, "You're safe here, for now." Some nights Marin would wake up drenched in sweat, chest heaving as if the air itself was too thick to pull down into her lungs. She'd lie there, eyes wide in the dark, tracing the warped lines of the cabin's ceiling with her gaze, while her ears strained for the sound of Grover Finch's boots, that heavy, staggered gait that always meant pain was coming. But all she ever heard was the hush of wind through the prairie grass outside and the soft crackle of the dying embers in the hearth. When she did manage to slip her feet onto the floorboards, she'd tiptoe so gingerly it looked like she was crossing broken glass. Each creak of the cabin's old planks sent her shoulders knotting tight, heart hammering like a trapped bird. Sometimes she'd freeze mid-step, breath caught, half certain Grover's voice would snarl from the shadows, calling her worthless, reminding her who she really was. But it never came. Just the wind. Just the soft breath of a man in the next room who never locked his door. Reese Hollow didn't need to bark orders. He showed Marin things in that quiet, patient way that made him feel more like a ghost than a savior. One morning he pressed a basket into her hands, calloused fingers brushing hers just enough to feel the tremor. "Check for cracks," he said, tilting the egg into a slant of dusty light from the cabin window. She nodded, so focused on not dropping the shell she missed the worry in his eyes. Another day, they mended the fence out back, the one the goats kept slipping through. Reese held the board steady while Marin clutched a hammer too big for her small hands. Every nail she drove bent sideways at first, her arms quivering with the strain of holding it right. But he didn't laugh, didn't scold, just pulled the nail out, smoothed the wood, and guided her hand again. Sometimes survival is a fence that holds the goats in. Sometimes it's a broken window patched together on a warm afternoon. Marin on the inside, holding the frame still, while Reese hammered down the trim outside. The wind rattled the glass as she leaned her forehead against the pane, and for a moment, just one moment, she didn't feel trapped behind it. They ate their meals at the same rough-hewn table Clara Hollow had once set for two. The table was small, just wide enough for a loaf of stale bread, and the beans Reese boiled over the fire. He'd push half the pot her way without a word, watching her chew each bite like it might vanish if she ate too fast. More than once she left a crust uneaten, fingers curling around the edges as if she might need it for later. "There'll be more tomorrow," Reese said every time. And the first few nights, she didn't believe him. But the bread kept coming. Flat, sometimes burnt around the edges, but warm. And with each bite, a little more of the old fear flaked away like charred crust. What nobody tells you is that freedom isn't always a gunfight. Sometimes it's in the way a door stays unlocked all night long. Sometimes it's in the way the cabin stayed quiet, even when the wind howled against the boards. Marin used to sit at the window, knees hugged tight to her chest, watching the chickens scratch at the frozen ground. She'd whisper old songs her mother used to hum while hanging laundry out to dry. One morning she realized she'd been singing out loud. Just a broken scrap of melody, but it caught in her throat so fast she clapped her hand over her mouth. Sometimes she'd catch herself humming an old tune. Reese heard her once, but didn't tease. He just leaned against the counter, setting down the pail, and let the silence say the rest. "It's all right. This house is yours too. And if you think this is just fiction, spun sugar for a Western campfire, remember the mail-order brides who stepped off dusty trains with calloused palms and hopes so thin it could snap in the first cold wind. Some were claimed by kind men, some by monsters. Some vanished into brothels behind locked saloon doors, paid off as debts just like Marin was. Or the orphan trains, those rail cars packed with wide-eyed children, each one carrying a tag with a stranger's name, and the hope of a bed to sleep in. Many of those girls never got a last name worth writing down. Maren Blythe carries all their ghosts in her footsteps across Reese Hollow's floor. And each day she wakes up without bruises is a prayer for every girl who didn't get that chance. It's not the grand gestures that free us. It's bread warming on the stove when you're too scared to ask for seconds. It's the window left unlatched because a man knows you're still learning to trust four walls. It's the quiet moment your own laugh bubbles up in a room that once only knew your fear. That's survival. Not the bullet, not the blood. Just the steady hum of a life that says, there's more tomorrow. When Zeke Marrow and Mr. Alcott rode up to Reese Hollow's ranch that first time, the sun was just tipping behind the cottonwoods, dragging shadows long across the yard. Maren Blythe was out near the chicken coop, grain spilling through her fingers, when she heard the hooves crunch the dry dirt. It wasn't the crack of boots on dust that turned her blood to ice. It was the hush. It was the way the yard went still as a graveyard at dusk. Even the hens froze, heads cocked like they knew danger when they heard it. Maren peeked around the coop and caught the flash of polished boots, dark coats that didn't belong out here among splintered fences and rusted hinges. Zeke Marrow climbed down first, spitting tobacco into the dirt like he owned the very ground Reese built with his bare hands. Behind him, Mr. Alcott slid from his saddle with the stiffness of a man unused to the saddle's sway, a city man carrying paper instead of a pistol, but somehow just as deadly. Reese stepped out onto the porch, calm as a weathered stone, shotgun slung easy in the crook of his arm. But if you'd looked close, real close, you'd have seen his jaw tick, the way his eyes flinched toward Maren like a silent warning. Stay back. Mr. Alcott cleared his throat, unfolding the parchment with a dramatic flick. Mr. Hollow, you know why we're here. This girl, Miss Blythe, was lawfully transferred as payment for Grover Finch's outstanding debt. She is, by all records filed, property of Mr. Marrow here until the debt is resolved or transferred again. Zeke flashed a grin that made Maren's gut twist. Don't worry, darling. This time you'll be worth every cent. The townsfolk peeked out from behind barn doors and sagging shutters. Maren caught the glint of old Mrs. Wallace's glasses through the wash-house slats, saw the way the curtain twitched shut again. Out here, folks knew better than to pick a side when men with money came calling. Reese's voice was low. You done, Alcott? The lawyer sniffed, shifting his coat back to reveal the pistol at his hip. Decorative, but loud enough to matter if someone didn't know better. I'm done speaking, Mr. Hollow. Now we expect you to comply. Hand her over. It's the law. Maren's heart thudded so hard she felt it in her throat. She could almost hear Grover Finch's voice echoing through the years. Ain't no law out here but the one you can pay for. She wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go that didn't end at the end of Zeke Marrow's rope. Reese didn't flinch. The law ain't worth the paper it's written on if it says a girl's property. She's not going back. Not today. Not ever. And you could see it then. The first flicker of something mean behind Mr. Alcott's measured eyes. The way Zeke's grin curdled into a sneer. But they didn't draw iron. Not yet. Men like that preferred to come back when no one else was watching, when the wind was howling too loud for the sheriff to hear a scream. That night, Maren sat hunched in the old rocking chair near the hearth. Her knees were pulled tight to her chest, arms wrapped so firm around herself it looked like she was holding her bones in place. Reese sat at the table, cleaning his shotgun in slow, deliberate strokes. The only sound in the room, the click of metal against metal. What if they come back with more men, she whispered. Her voice cracked on the word men, like it still tasted like poison in her mouth. What if the sheriff says they're right? Reese didn't look up right away. He set the shotgun down, wiped his hand on his shirt, then finally turned to her. His eyes were dark, deeper than the canyon that split the land behind the barn. Then let 'em come, he said, voice so calm it made her shiver. You're not going back. But Maren saw it, that flicker behind his eyes, the dread he would never speak aloud. He knew what happened to men who stood against the law when the law wore a rich man's coat. He knew what it meant to have the town turn its back, to stand alone when the dust rose and the boots came stomping. Sometimes on nights like that, Maren would think about the old story. The legend that some folks whispered around the lantern when the wind howled too hard. They said a woman named Ada Bell once stood right where Marin now slept, up in the canyon ridge, where Reese built his fence line. Ada Bell, who shot the man who tried to drag her off, put 2 bullets in his chest and vanished into the rock and scrub pine like smoke. Some folks swear her ghost still roams that ridge. They say if you listen close, you can hear her spurs on the shale, her pistol cocking under the moon, watching, waiting, keeping the next girl from being dragged into the dark. Maybe it was just a story, but sometimes a story is all you've got when the boots come crunching down the yard. The parchment says you're worth less than a sack of feed, and the law looks the other way. Some stories never die. They just teach the next soul to stand her ground and fight. When the night came that Zeke Marrow and Mr. Alcott returned, no lanterns, no mercy, the air felt like it held its breath. The ranch yard, quiet just hours before, turned into a place of bruises and blood beneath a pale sliver of moon. Zeke was the first to swing. His fist cracked against Reese Hollow's jaw so hard that Reese staggered backward into the fence post, splinters digging into his shoulder. But Reese wasn't a man who stayed down. Not when a man like Zeke spat words like property at a girl who'd fought so damn hard to remember she was human. Reese lunged forward, fists splitting skin on Zeke's cheekbone, knuckles tearing open as if they'd been waiting years for this. They fought like men who knew what losing felt like. Raw, ugly, desperate. Marin Blythe saw it all from the porch. She should have been hidden inside. That's what the old Marin would have done. But this Marin stepped out into the yard, lip already split from where Alcott had backhanded her for daring to shove him away. Blood ran warm down her chin, but her feet stayed planted in the hard, cold dirt. Mr. Alcott grabbed her by the arm, fingers like iron, voice a hiss of disgust. "Did you really think you'd be free, girl? You're property. Always were, always will be." Something in her snapped. Maybe it was the taste of blood on her tongue. Maybe it was the echo of Grover Finch's drunken curses all those years ago. Or maybe it was the ghost of Ada Bell, the woman folks swore still watched from the canyon ridge, whispering, "Don't you dare look away." Marin didn't flinch. She spat the blood back in Alcott's face and wrenched her arm free. "I'm not yours." It was Reese's shout that split the night next. A roar of rage as he drove his shoulder into Zeke's gut, slamming him into the dirt so hard the wind left Zeke's lungs in a gasp. The fight should have ended there, but the land has a way of keeping score. Alcott went for his pistol. Marin saw the glint. Reese moved faster. The crack of the shotgun echoed across the scrubland, a single shot tearing through the dark. The gun never fired back. Silence. Just the wind. Just the smell of spent powder and sweat and fear that had finally burned itself out. But what made the difference that night wasn't just the gunshot that dropped Zeke to his knees, or the fact that Alcott stumbled off bleeding and half blind into the sagebrush, never to crawl back to Dustle again. It was the next morning, when the sun rose blood orange over the ridge and a knock came on the cabin door. Old May Wallace, who'd watched from her wash house window but hadn't come before, stood there with a loaf of warm bread wrapped in a ragged tea towel. She didn't say a word, just set the bread on Marin's table and gave her a look that said, "You're not alone." Then came Mr. Clegg with a wagon full of scrap lumber, enough to mend the fence that had splintered in the fight. Behind him, a boy from town with a bag of nails, a young widow who set down a basket of fresh eggs, like an offering at an altar. No speeches, no promises, just hands willing to carry a piece of what would otherwise crush one person's shoulders flat. Because the truth is, no one survives alone. Not out here where the wind claws through cracks in your cabin walls. Not when the law says you're worth less than a man's debt. Not when the ghosts that haunt you come wearing polished boots and silver tongue. That morning, Marin stood on the porch, bruises still purple along her jaw, hair tangled from the fight, and watched her neighbors stack that lumber against Reese's barn. She felt her throat tighten, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was something else. Something like warmth, something like relief, something like the first soft seed of belonging taking root in the bruised garden of her ribs. Later that week, word spread through Dustle. Some called her foolish. A girl should know her place. Some spat at Reese Hollow's name for crossing men like Zeke and Alcott. But some, the ones who'd been silent too long, found their courage in the crack of that shotgun, found their hope in the stubborn grit of a girl who'd once been called nothing more than property. When Marin Blythe stood on that porch again, weeks later, her lip healed, her voice steady as dawn, she looked out across the yard she'd nearly bled for and whispered to herself, "I'm not yours. I'm not his. I'm mine." She wasn't just a girl who'd been rescued. She was reforged. Her chains melted down and beaten into something sharp enough to cut back. A blade, not a shackle. A name, not a debt. And that's the lesson in all this blood and silence and bread left warm on the table. You are not ruined. You're just reforged. And some fires burn you so you can stand brighter than before, unclaimed, unbroken, and never, ever owned again. Sometimes the stories we tell about the old frontier still echo in the places we live now. Maybe you've never stood on a ranch porch with a shotgun in your hand, but you might know what it feels like to fight for a piece of dignity the world keeps trying to take from you. Marin Blythe's story isn't just about the dust and blood of the Wild West. It's about any time you've stood up when everyone else said stay down. It's about neighbors showing up, not because they had to, but because they knew nobody survives alone. It's about the power of saying, "I'm not yours, I'm mine." Even now, in a world so different from Reese Hollow's, too many people still feel like they don't own their names, their stories, their futures. Maybe you see that in your own family, your town, your country. So I hope you carry this lesson with you tonight. You're not ruined, you're reforged. And maybe you have your own tale of survival, big or small. If you do, we'd love to read it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What did this story make you feel? Do you think neighbors still stand up like that today? Thank you for sitting with us through this quiet, hard fight under the desert stars. If you felt something tonight, please like this video, subscribe for more true-hearted stories, and share it with someone who needs to remember. There'll always be more tomorrow.